Hello, everyone. Welcome to Rethinking Diversity in Publishing Lasting Change, which is the second Business of Books event here at the Edinburgh International Book Festival 2021. I am Sonali Misra.
And I'm Grace Balfour-Harrell, and we are coming to you from the amazing hybrid book festival setup here at the Edinburgh College of Art.
We are the co-chairs of the Society of Young Publishers Scotland, an entirely volunteer-run organization that supports aspiring publishing professionals and those within the first 10 years of their publishing careers through events and programs such as mentorship schemes, panel discussions, workshops and masterclasses, networking socials, book clubs, Twitter chats, a spring annual conference, and more.
This month, SYP Scotland is thrilled to collaborate with the Edinburgh International Book Festival on a panel discussion that takes its cue from the 2020 Rethinking Diversity in Publishing report, and we are lucky to have one of its authors with us today as a speaker.
We are also excited to have Ella P. Wakatama OBE, Honorary FRSL, as the chair for this panel. Ella Wakatama is editor-at-large at Canongate and has had an illustrious career in the streams of writing and publishing. She is the Creative Manchester Senior Research Fellow at the School of New Writing, University of Manchester, the chair of AKI Kane Prize for African Writing, the former deputy editor of Granta magazine, the founding publishing director of the Indigo Press. Honestly, we could go on and on because the list of her accolades is just that impressive. Thank you so much for leading the discussion today, Ella.
Before we hand over to Ella to commence what is going to be a thought-provoking and important discussion, we'd like to inform you all that after this panel event, there will be a post-event discussion on Zoom at 11:30, which will be led by Sonali and I, so that we can continue to engage with the key points raised in this panel. After all, we are the future of publishing, and it is up to us to ensure lasting change. The Zoom link for the post-event discussion will be shared in the chat near the end of this panel, and it will be a free event, so please do join. We're also live tweeting this panel from our Twitter account at SYP Scotland using the hashtag Rethinking Diversity. Feel free to tweet along with us today. And now, over to you, Ella.
I wanted to start off by thanking Sonali and Grace. That was a lovely introduction. And also to thank the Society of Young Publishers for co-sponsoring the event and our colleagues at the Edinburgh International Book Festival for hosting us this morning. This time last year, we hosted another event on the Diversity in Publishing report. And to me, it feels like a very eventful year. So I'm looking forward to discussing with the panelists to hear their feelings about what has happened and also to think really carefully about where we're going in the future. Let me start by introducing our speaker who is going to begin things this morning for us. Dr. Anamik Shaha is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. His research interests are in race and the media, with a particular focus on the cultural industries and issues of diversity, and rather usefully, diversity there is in italics. He is the author of Race and Cultural Industries, published by Polity in 2018, and his latest book, Race, Culture, Media, was published by Sage in 2021. I'm also joined this morning by my dear friend and my constant inspiration, Margaret Busby, CBE. Margaret, Nana Akuya Akon, is a major cultural figure in Britain and around the world. She's a long-time campaigner for diversity in publishing, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and recipient of several honorary doctorates and awards, including the Bocas Henry Swansea Award, the Royal Society of Literature's Benson Medal, the Royal Africa Society's inaugural Africa Rights Lifetime Achievement Award, and the London Book Fair Lifetime Achievement Award. Welcome. I'd also like to introduce someone who is a colleague and a friend, Crystal Mahey Morgan, who is a publisher and a literary agent. Crystal began her career as a freelance journalist at the age of 16, writing for publications such as The Guardian and The Face magazine. While still 16, and anyone who knows Crystal won't be at all surprised by this precocious achievement, she promoted a series of open mic events, which were a fusion of hip-hop and more conventional forms of poetry, and was a performance poet herself. Alongside running Own It, she has a number of roles, including marketing and sales director at Zed Books, brand strategy and marketing consultant, the literary consultancy. She's an MA publishing lecturer, at Kingston University and a publicist for Patrice Kahn-Cullors, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Crystal, welcome. And finally, I'd like to introduce Samantha Williams, who is the founder of Book Love. After 15 years of working in the media with no publishing experience, Samantha was frustrated by the lack of diversity and cultural representation in TV and in books. This motivated her to create Book Love, a traveling multicultural book carnival that brings inclusive, anti-racist, multicultural, and bilingual adult and children's books, multicultural toys, and flags from around the world to schools, markets, festivals, and other events around the country. Please join me in welcoming our wonderful panel. I'm pretending that you're all clapping at your laptops around the world. Dr. Saha, I'd like to invite you to start us off this morning. And I just wonder if you could give us your feedback and I guess report and summary of the Rethinking Diversity in Publishing report. And it'll set the direction for where we'll go this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that introduction. It's a real thanks to the organisers for inviting me onto this panel with such inspirational figures. It's an absolute pleasure and a little bit nerve-wracking, to be honest with you. But yeah, let me just, apologies. Apologies. It's always a bad idea to start with an apology, right? But I know many of you who are tuning in have probably heard me rabbit on about this report, which was published a year ago now, a little over a year ago. And, quite frankly, what a year it has been. When we started the research back in 2019, there was no way we could have anticipated what was going to unfold in that time and, subsequently after the launch. I just want to kind of start off by saying, though, kind of thinking about why this stuff matters. Because quite frankly, in light of COVID, in light of Black Lives Matter, police brutality, ongoing examples of racial violence enacted against some of the most dispossessed in society, sometimes it might feel like the business of writing, making and selling books can feel a little bit trivial. Why does this stuff matter? What role can it play in any kind of social justice program? We're dealing in the kind of exchange of commodities, essentially. But if you think about racism, if racism is about the dehumanization of people of color, about taking away the value of Black, brown and Asian lives, and COVID has shown how dispensable these lives are, one of the powerful things about books, and especially trade fiction, which was the subject of this report, is how they can restore the humanity of people of color whose lives have been devalued. So there are two questions here then, which kind of leads into the report. And that is, where are the stories and books by writers of colour? And when they are published, if they are afforded that privilege, to what extent are they given the freedom to write the stories that they want to tell in the way that they want to tell them, including the issue of how their books are packaged, promoted and sold? So it's not even just about whether we can tell the stories we want to tell, but how those stories end up appearing in the marketplace. Because as we all know, these things affect how those stories are interpreted and received and read. So while our report kind of tackles the first question, it was a second question in particular that we felt was underexplored. I was kind of referring then, without mentioning it, to the Writing the Future report from 2015, which was published and produced by our partners on this project, Spread the Word, who, in one of the findings from that report was how they, in speaking to authors of colour, those authors described how they felt they were steered into reproducing particular stereotypes about race and ethnicity by kind of their white editors and agents and so on. And that was the issue we wanted to delve deeper into. And this is why we need to rethink diversity, which is often so obsessed with numbers, looking at the composition of the workforce. And for us, that's not necessarily the issue by itself. In fact, what it is for us is whether writers of colour have the same creative freedoms as their white counterparts. That's the issue that we wanted to explore. So this report is free to download on rethinkingdiversity.org, so you can check it out yourself. But essentially, in a nutshell, for this project, we looked at the entire publishing process. We looked at three key stages of production: acquisition, promotion, and sales book selling. We interviewed over 110 people who worked at each of these stages of production, 40% of whom were BAME, a term that obviously, as you can tell, we're deeply ambivalent about, and the rest were people who were white. We interviewed senior and junior people who worked across big and small publishing companies, agencies, and booksellers. I say we, I want to give a shout out to Sandra Van Nente, who worked on the project with me. And quite simply, in terms of our findings, what we found that writers of colour were not given the same freedoms. There were fears over their quality. There were fears over their authenticity. There were fears that their stories would be considered too niche. Writers of colour are seen as a riskier investment, which is why publishers are not willing to invest in too many of them, as this might be too much for the audience. Which brings us on to another core finding. And I guess for many of you in this room, you will know this already, but nonetheless, here it goes. Publishing industry sees its core audience as white and middle class. The entire industry is set up for this one narrow demographic. As a result, writers of colour need to be seen to be having value for that demographic, and they are packaged accordingly. While this does afford some writers some opportunities, and there's some great publishers doing great work with them, it can also lead to literal whitewashing or exoticization. It also ignores how some writers of colour want to write for their own communities as well. And adjacent to this issue is how publishers, booksellers undervalue minority audiences, or rather, they don't see value in the books that they would think they would need to make for them in order to attract them. Those minority audiences are seen as economically unviable. They're seen, more often than not, they're seen as an added extra onto the core audience. But generally, as we found, publishers don't see cultural value. Where is the cultural value in, for instance, going to Bradford and engaging with the South Asian community, the working class South Asian communities in Bradford? They don't see value in doing that. So publishers see the moral value in diversity. They understand that they need to do better. But we, as the authors of this report, were not persuaded that they see the economic value. Otherwise, they would be doing more to attract these audiences. So just to wrap up, I hope I haven't gone on for too long. What we found is that the publishing industry, as we said, is set up for a single white middle class audience. And as a result, it has created a system of cultural production that harms writers of colour. That was a quote from Alia Gulmani, who wrote a brilliant chapter which referred to the report and puts in words better than we did at the findings of this report, that the publishing relies on the system of cultural production that harms writers of colour. For every single publisher in this room right now, I want you to think about that deeply. What does that actually mean to think about like I said, a process that actually harms writers of colour? It's not going to be fixed as well, I just want to add, by just inserting more people of colour, especially if they're inserted into the junior roles and they have little effect on the process itself. So those are it's that focus on cultural production that is the reason why we need to rethink diversity. It's not just about inserting more Black, Brown, Asian bodies into the industry, but actually how we can transform the industry such that the publishing process is more as I said, affords the same creative freedoms to writers of colour so they can tell the stories that they want to tell in the way that they want to tell them. So that's my little summary of our report. Like I said, you can download it for free. Let me hand it back to Ella.
Thank you, Annemiek. This wasn't scripted, but I do have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. I really appreciated how forthright this all sounds, as in focusing in on the active damage done rather than it being sort of some kind of passive accident of history. And that active harming of writers of colour, I think, is really important. And so I was really struck by that. One of the things you said was that books can restore humanity. And you also talked about the dehumanization of people of colour. My question to you, I guess, is in the findings of the report, I immediately ask myself, how can someone else restore humanity? Because as you're speaking, the only solution that comes to my mind is to publish our own books by ourselves. And I just wondered what you thought of that, and if you think that perhaps in trying to change an existing system, it's a losing battle, and if not, why is there still hope?
That's a really good question, Ellen. A really difficult question, and actually one of the things in this report. And look, we're academics. We're not going to tell publishers how they can publish books better. I put my hands up. I don't have any experience in this industry. One of the reasons we picked publishing was precisely because I read a lot of books, but I know so little about the industry. So actually, it was coming from a position of ignorance that kind of made publishing such an interesting case study. And invariably, it does. We did kind of engage with that question of whether rights of color need to go on their own. And one of the things that was really evident was how independent publishers, particularly those run by minority groups, were often the spaces where writers of color were given the autonomy, the same autonomies as their white counterparts. And that's not to, I don't want to kind of diminish the kind of role of editors and agents and their expertise they bring, their experience they bring, their understanding of markets and what work and what doesn't. So I don't want to diminish those people. So it's not just that every single kind of writer should be just given the freedom to do whatever they want. Actually, writers very much benefit from those people. But nonetheless, it was in those independent presses where they were pushing the boat out a bit more. They were more willing to take risks. They were more, they had a deeper relationship with their own communities. They knew the wants and desires of those communities as well as their authors, and they can facilitate more meaningful relationships. They have better relationships with particular booksellers as well, who are embedded within those communities. So this isn't so, as much as I don't necessarily want to move to a kind of nationalistic politics that says we need our own media and we need our own presses. But nonetheless, one of the things that when I think of like concrete things that can come out of this report, I am very much interested in what forms of policy are needed in order to support and fund those independent presses and enterprises that I think myself and Sandra believe are actually doing a better job of pulling minoritized, racialized audiences into book culture. And I think, one of them kind of more radical suggestions we make. I'm not sure if people are going to buy this, but we need to replace the benign language of diversity, which, everyone's on a diversity bandwagon. But what happens if we start framing it in terms of an idea of reparative justice? So in the sense that, kind of an understanding that Black, brown, Asian communities have been kind of, certainly in the West, have been exploited and have kind of, been on the receiving end of, like I say, kind of forms of oppression. What, as a way of addressing that, giving these communities a platform to tell their own stories and restore their own humanity, to what extent would that, can we replace, like I said, diversity with, a more radical gesture of reparative justice? I know that's, for a lot of people that might be a bit difficult to swallow, but quite frankly, before Black Lives Matter, we weren't talking about defunding the police, and all of a sudden this is on the agenda. A lot of work and campaigning needs to be done around these issues, but that's, I think this will benefit everyone. I think this is good for society if we can.
It'll benefit everyone. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for that really thoughtful answer to the question. And also, it just seems we have so much to talk about. As you speak, I immediately think, okay, we don't have much time and there's so much to cram in. Thank you very much.
Never enough time.
Never enough time. Let's move on to the main panel discussion, just sort of taking off from Dr. Saha's comments. And I actually, I know I had to start off with looking at the past, but given what Onomik just said, Crystal, I'd like to come to you first. I'm really struck by this, going back to that idea of restorative or reparative justice, and this idea of not having a benign language of diversity, and that switching that the report is encouraging us to do when we think about active harm. And I'm just really struck about what I know of your work, Crystal, and not just own it, but also starting up an agency and having experienced the way that you advocate for your authors as a publisher who's commissioned a book from you. I know that you are fierce in defense of their rights and what they are owed, actually. I just wondered if you would speak to us a little bit about the inspiration behind starting Own It and how you feel that your work is actually sort of, I guess, a preemptive response to the findings of a report such as this.
Mm-hmm. I think it was not so much an inspiration to start Own It, but what felt like a necessity. So if I think about my own experience, I worked in mainstream publishing for maybe 10 years. I worked at PFD Literary Film and TV Agency. I then worked at Random House, which became Penguin Random House. So I was very much within mainstream publishing. And during my time there, all of the findings of this report and previous reports were things that I felt very firsthand as a reality as part of my day to day. And I think there was a lot of assumptions that were made constantly, assumptions about me and what I could and couldn't do as a person working within publishing who was not a traditional publishing type, assumptions about audiences, about authors. And it really started to build up in a way that it felt like I couldn't make the change that I wanted to make within publishing. And the only way it felt like I could actually make real change, and not passive change, but proactive, long lasting change, was to step outside of mainstream publishing and build something alternative. But in doing that, not to have that as something siloed or ghettoized. So to build something alternative, but to build something that was leading the industry rather than kind of outside of the industry, but to do that on our own terms. So it started as a publishing house. You mentioned all of the things that I was doing alongside Own It at the time, and that was again necessity. Like it's very difficult to go from a salarized job to starting up an independent company when you come from the background I come from, and you don't have safety nets, and you don't, and this is also largely why it's quite a monochrome industry, because it doesn't pay very well. It's not very kind of competitive in terms of the people it employs. And so there's like a number of symptoms which lead to this cycle of a report needing to be written every 5 years, 10 years, because nothing really changes. So I did all of those things just to survive, honestly. Like, I left with no plan. I was in a meeting one Monday morning, and it got too much. I phoned my husband that afternoon, and I'm like, I'm coming home. I'm handing in my resignation letter tomorrow. And he was kind of like, are you crazy? Like, what's going on? But it was just a build up of knowing that change needed to happen, and I couldn't do it where I was. So I set up Own It with my husband as an independent press. What we started to see is actually a lot of what Onomik said. Because of who we were, we had access to different audiences. We weren't making the same assumptions that most publishers were making. And what we could do was build a business that was year-on-year growth, commercially kind of viable, but also speaking to audiences that publishing wasn't, empowering authors that publishing wasn't. And that was something that felt like an act of protest. It felt like activism. Like Nick said, it wasn't just about the business of publishing books in a commodity. It was about life. And actually our tagline is because stories are life. And I think this idea of stories humanizing and dehumanizing people when not handled in the right way is really the core of all of our humanity. And I think as publishers and within the industry, we have such a responsibility that has never been taken seriously. And so this is kind of what we were trying to do. Maybe 3 years in, so Own It's now 6 years old. About 3 years into having the press up and running, we decided to launch the Literary Film and TV Agency. What's quite interesting about that is our first two clients that we signed were Courtier Newland and Selena Godden. Anyone that knows either of those people knows that they are pioneers. They've been in the industry for a good 20 years, producing valuable, important work. The fact that in those 20 years, they were unable to find an agent that they felt represented their needs and could push their careers to where they needed to go says a lot about the industry. And again, that really was born out of a necessity. It felt like we couldn't publish everyone we wanted to publish. We could help authors by representing them. And I think I'm quite lucky that when I was at Penguin Random House, I spent 3 years in contracts, I spent 3 years in sales. So I have this industry knowledge that often we lack when we come from certain communities because we're never given access. So for me, it was about using all of that and making sure that that was being kind of benefiting the right people, or the people that traditionally wasn't being benefited by those things. So yeah, it was less an inspiration and more of a necessity. And I think this idea of us being like having our own stories and being in control of those, and pushing the value of those, whether that's in contracts and advances, whether that's in marketing and the way they're packaged and who the audiences are, and the fact that not one type of book will have one author. So we publish books that speak to audiences that publishing aren't speaking to, but that's not the only audience for this. We publish universal stories that are for everyone, and I think that's sometimes where publishing goes wrong. Everything's very siloed, and that can be very damaging.
Thank you, Crystal. It does strike me, that along with Anonymous, that the panel here, you're three women of color who have started up your own thing in a kind of response to different moments in time. Margaret, if I could turn to you now, as Crystal is describing her journey to being both a publisher and an agent and so many other roles, and Crystal was just mentioning the fact that she started out after a Monday morning at work that didn't go very well. And it reminded me of your story of starting Alison and Busby, where it was, when you speak about it, it's very much let's start a publishing house because we need to publish these books. Can you talk a little bit about that experience, but also sort of, I guess, connecting it with hearing a similar story from Crystal years down the line, and just where you think we are now in comparison?
Thank you, Ella. I'm really grateful to be on this panel, but in some ways it's daunting. I mean, I endorse everything that Onomix said and Crystal said, and it's important that these things are revisited. But to go back, I mean, I as you said, I've been in the industry for half a century or more. Before most people were born on this panel. And when I started, it wasn't started, I didn't start from a position of knowing what the industry was like, as Crystal did. I started from not knowing what it was like, so not knowing what I should be doing. And before I started, it's important to point out that in 1966, New Beacon Books was started by John LaRose. It was the first publishing company started by a black person. John was of Caribbean origin. And there's also New Beacon Books, which continues to this day. And one of the things that concerns me always is the fact that when people talk about publishers or booksellers, they're usually not including any of us on this panel. So it's always a them and us thing. And I think we have to be concerned that we're not seen as them often enough. And we ourselves are guilty of seeing it that way, as if we have to wait for them to do something for us. And as Crystal has shown, we don't have to do that. But we have to try and make sure that the industry doesn't do us a favor, because what we're arguing for is to make literature for us all better. In fact, I'll go back to a quote. In 1987, I interviewed Toni Morrison before she'd won any major prizes. And we talked about some different things, including the fact that she had been an editor at Random House in America, and the need for that inclusion in the industry. And she said to me, I'll give you the quote. It said, "It's not about patronage, affirmative action we're talking about here. We're talking about the life of a country's literature." And I think that's what it's about. We're not saying do us a favor. We're saying let's make the country's literature more relevant, more dynamic, more interesting for everybody involved, wherever they come from. We're not even talking about diversity only to mean ethnicity, we're talking about class, region, all sorts of different things that have to infuse the industry to make it more relevant to anybody who might be interested in reading. And it's a business, certainly, but it's also about culture and politics. So it's all of those things that need to be considered if anybody in the industry wants to continue being relevant, and not just to be jumping on a bandwagon, if you like, because of something that happened last year, the murder of George Floyd, or the Black Lives Matter movements getting more amplified. And there are publishers, independent publishers usually, have always done the right thing. I mean, you're working for one of them in a role as an editor. So there are publishers who've done the right thing and have been rewarded for doing the right thing by publishing books that are not seen to be normal books and yet win prizes. And I use normal because as recently as 2019, when I was doing some promotion for the anthology I published that year, which you were in, Ella, New Daughters of Africa, I was at a festival and talking to a member of the audience afterwards who said they'd had a talk from a mainstream publisher who had actually been talking about normal books and diverse books. And I think that is shocking, the fact that normal does not include any of us on this panel. So I really don't know what there is to say.
We're all nodding as if we're in church. Margaret, thank you for that. There's a lot there that I think is quite sort of provoking, as in demanding action. Before I turn to Samantha, Anamik, I wonder if you could respond to what Crystal and Margaret have just talked about, focusing especially on moral and cultural value, which were two things you brought up. As a publisher who has a 19-year-old, a cat and a dog to feed, I'm really interested in commercial value. This is how I make my living. And so I wondered, do you think that it's about linking that cultural and moral value to the commercial imperative, to the economic value of something? Is that a way forward? Or do you think that having them as three separate things is at all helpful to the writers of color?
Again, another really brilliant and difficult question, Ella. I mean, the publishers, like I said in our interviews, they all very strongly articulate the moral case for diversity, why we need to do better. We need to publish books that better reflect our society and the world we're in. Everyone kind of spoke, as you could imagine, everyone spoke very eloquently about that. Then they would talk about the economic case for diversity as though it was a natural extension. And then obviously, if we publish more diversity, then we will engage more diverse audiences, again, diversity in scare quotes, and therefore we'll, economically benefit. And so it felt like in our research, we felt that publishers seem to suggest that those two things are perfectly aligned, moral and economic value. But actually they don't, we weren't persuaded that they actually, as I said, believe in the economic value of diversity, if you like. Saying that, I'm not convinced that that is the way move forward to, the challenge therefore is to actually show mainstream publishers that they can make money off the back of Black, Brown, Asian authors and other minoritized groups. There is that your publishers are in the business of selling commodities, but books are alongside film, television, these cultural commodities, there's something very, very particular about them. They can make people a lot of money, but also they enrich our lives through what they represent and what they symbolize. And as a result, to kind of broadly speaking, to what extent does a system which is purely driven by profit actually being able to deliver the potential of the symbolic value of these commodities? And that's why I want to kind of think about government policy in a way that actually takes seriously the symbolic cultural specificity of books, and to what extent can policy intervene and arrange production so that we can realize that potential. And as I say, so as a suggestion, for instance, what would it look like for, say Crystal's company to receive money, from the state? you know, in a way that Crystal's allowed to have full autonomy for the work that you do, but you were supported adequately because there was a recognition of the cultural value of the books that you were producing. So it's that. So that's where I think, as much as, you know, I'd like to see more people of, I appreciate efforts that are trying to get more people of color in these industries. Actually, I think there's really bigger kind of, if we really want we really want the radical transformation, then actually it's a much bigger macro question, actually, which takes us, as I say, into questions of policy and lobbying and all of that. So yeah, so the question, and that is, you know, that is the fundamental tension that everyone in this room, in this audience, face as publishers. That tension between kind of wanting to produce great works of art and powerful forms of culture, but also you're a business and you need to make money, and, as you know, you need to pay for your cat, Ella, you know. So
He's a fat,
you know, so I mean, we don't know, you know, I don't know how greedy your cat is, but that's the fundamental tension. And until you are not that, then we're always going to be, you know, we're going to be meeting here every year.
Yeah. Samantha, I'd like to turn to you now, and it segues very nicely into what Anamik was saying, in that if we're thinking about wider areas, one of those obviously is education. And what strikes me is that, you know, your work is focusing on children's books and toys and I guess other learning tools, and in schools as well. Can you speak a little bit about what difference you feel it makes, the kind of work that you do in promoting these different kinds of faces and stories and lives, focused at that very sort of impressionable and very, very important market? I do know that we have a slight delay with Samantha, but I hope you could hear the question.
Yeah, I can hear it. Hello, hopefully you can hear me. If at any time
Yes.
I break up, wave and then I move around, I'm at a music festival. So taking books into spaces like this is very much that I do. So in response to your question about getting toys and books to a large audience in a very efficient, exciting and dynamic way, we come to festivals. And this came up recently. I was booked for the Edinburgh talk that we're on now before. Sorry, I dubbed, but this opportunity came up. Yeah, I think listening to all of you speak, I've actually got mentions as well about, and this is something I wrestle with as well, like, how much do I care about the politics of this conversation versus doing the work that I do? And it sounds a bit strange, but what I really mean by that is I'm constantly having these battles and these every single day coming into publishing and books and being very new how to do it and just kind of following this hat. And I do it and I love it, believe in it. And then I also feel like what Amit was saying about, you know, that tension of, you know, having to engage in these conversations and these things and sometimes just thinking, actually, I don't want to have these discussions anymore. I don't actually really care. And then I think, no, but I'm an activist. I need to have these discussions. And then I think, no, I just want to sell books. I don't want to be the diverse bookseller or the multicultural bookseller. So those tensions that I face as well. And like, they're quite distressing because I think, you know, if I were normal, if I were like a white middle class bookseller, and I don't literally mean normal, you know, I'm just facetious there, or very facetious, but you know, those are not tensions that they have. And I'm assuming maybe there are other tensions that white privileged middle class booksellers have, but you know, those are real tensions that are kind of like suffocating as well. I think this is a really very difficult times. Whilst I'm optimistic and hopeful,
Samantha, we're having trouble seeing you, so while we try and sort that out, hearing you rather. If I may just sort of move to Margaret while we sort that out to continue on that idea. So what Samantha is talking about makes me think about other initiatives right now and thinking about some of those struggles, which clearly to me seem structural, because you speak about those tensions that you have to face as a bookseller and somebody who's selling a specific product, and that acknowledging that there may be tensions that more mainstream, or as we're calling them in this panel, normal booksellers are facing. And I just, Samantha, if you are back with us, maybe you could answer this question, but I just wonder if you think that some of those tensions are as a result of wider structural issues that make it more difficult, let's say, if you were working in a similar industry as a woman of color, or do you think they're unique to our business? That's for you, Samantha.
I really hope you can hear me. I was television for almost 60, pretty broken. And I would jump into it like relief. I was so wrong. I'm sad to say that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I really feel that all sectors, look, we're speaking within a British context now, are in this position that people of colour are not heard, we're not seen, we're not allowed to excel, we're put in a box. This is not a opportunity problem.
I do wonder about that. Yeah. Samantha, I am going to stop you there because it's too difficult for us to hear you. I'm so sorry. I'm going to try and come back to you as the conversation goes on, hoping that our connection improves. I'm particularly sorry because I wanted to press you on that point of we are not seen, we are not heard, we're not listened to, because it comes back to where we started, that idea of somebody else being able to restore our humanity. And I just, because my response to that being seen or heard has always been, but if I can see you and Margaret, Arnamic and Crystal can see you, who is the person who's not seeing you, and do we really care? So I wondered about that. Margaret, the last year has seen the establishment of organizations such as the Black Writers Guild and the Black Agents and Editors Association. And I just wonder if you could speak about those kinds of initiatives happening right now and what we've seen happening the last year. Is this something that makes you feel as if we're in a moment of change? Do you think that we'll finally break this 5-year cycle of another report on the same thing, and some people like Dr. Saha having to put their efforts to tell us again what we need to do, when I think maybe for lots of people of color working in the industry, we already know what to do. How does the moment we're in now make you feel or think about the industry?
Well, I really have to feel optimistic, because otherwise, where do we go? We can't keep repeating the same mistakes. We can't have a report every decade and expect things to have changed unless we actually do something to make things change. And I'm glad to see this new review that Onamik has been part of, because perhaps we now will find people taking on board some of the suggestions, some of the conclusions. And it's to do with engaging with communities other than those, the old normal, if you like. And this has always happened. I mean, in the same way that Samantha is now engaging in terms of book selling with diverse, so-called diverse books. Well, think of the 80s when Verna Wilkins started Tamarin Books, children's books which featured children of color because her children needed those. And she actually took the books to, hair shows or wherever, as did Bogle Lubitschor in the 60s, as did Newt Meakin books. You have to go to where the communities are. And that's what Anna was saying, in a way. You can't just sit in an ivory tower and be normal and exclude everybody else, because they're not the same, their normal is different from your normal. So, and also, we can't always be the ones to tell the mainstream wider industry what to do. We can't do all the work ourselves. If you have I quote something that I heard Marianne Jean-Baptiste say: if I'm not invited to your party, don't ask me what to do about it. Don't ask me why. What are you going to do about it?
Yes.
So I think we have to be hopeful that people have got the idea they've got to send out more invitations, perhaps, to get a different audience at that party. But we have to build on the lessons and hope that this is not we don't need another report after this, that there are so many wonderful findings that are in this report, this review, that we should just try and see their action taken on them, or we don't have to see. Those who know that they ought to be taking action should do so.
There's something that appeals to me very much in that handing over of the responsibility, as in it's your party, so cry if you want to, I guess. I'm going to move now to audience questions, because we have quite a number of them already, and I'll start with asking Crystal to answer the first one, and then hopefully we can move on to include Samantha as well. Crystal, the first question comes from Lola, who says, do you believe works by authors of color and minorities are more heavily scrutinized than others? I'm going to edit what she says there and say that works by authors of color and minoritized groups, as I've learned from Onomik today, are more heavily scrutinized than others. That's for you, Crystal.
Yeah, in short, the short answer is yes. I think if we understand the reasons why that is, publishing is obviously a business, and it's interesting. It was interesting hearing you speak earlier, Onomik, about the navigation between commercial and creative and cultural. For me, like, I'll just say off the bat, I'm very commercial minded. Like, I have to be. I don't. Where as an independent business, there is no government state funding, and there's no ability to get things wrong. We don't have a top 5% best-selling authors that subsidize everything else, so we have to be very commercially minded. And I think publishing is a business, and so what happens is when someone's considering a new work, they'll essentially put together what's called a P&L, a profit and loss sheet, and there are a number of factors which are contributing to where that will get to, and what kind of advance will be paid to the author, and how many books they think that author will sell. And it's very much coming from a commercial mind. And I think the problem there is so many assumptions, misguided, misplaced assumptions are made, often because publishers look at comparable titles. So you get a book, you think, okay, what's a comparable title? How did that book sell? And what indication would that give me of how this book will sell? Because publishing has traditionally not packaged, understood, got right kind of books from minoritized kind of communities and audiences, these P&Ls are being based on very kind of wrong assumptions. And so, yeah, in that sense, this work is being scrutinized in a way that other work isn't being scrutinized. And then if you want to think on a cultural level, it's very much about audiences. So, everyone's mentioned, is there a viable audience for this book? And if that editor or that publishing house doesn't understand an audience that it's not interacted with before, then that's being scrutinized in a way that a book by a white middle class author isn't. So on a number of levels, both commercially, culturally and creatively, there's so much scrutiny that people who are not traditional writers from the sense of the publishing industry's point of view have to battle against that others don't. Even the fact that a white middle class author could publish a book and it not do very well, but still have the opportunity to publish a second. For authors who come from kind of minoritized communities, they don't really have that. You've got to come, and you've got to come hard, otherwise your opportunity's gone. Or worse still, a book by one, say, Black author, Asian author, working class author hasn't worked. So therefore there's an assumption that no book by any people from these communities will work. So there's so much burden on writers of color, and I see it day in, day out as an agent. And I do have to fight hard for my authors because they're already coming up against so many barriers that other authors are not.
Okay, that's really useful. I'm struck there by what you are saying about the that level of scrutiny, and you were talking about it from a business perspective without sort of bringing in the, I guess, editorial concerns or the critical responses. And it seems to me at this point, exactly right. Samantha said something interesting earlier, I think it was Samantha, about sometimes she just wants to sell books and she doesn't want to engage in the conversation at all. And some of the things that you are talking about do seem like a constant battle. Do you feel that there is, given that you spoke very much about sort of the not being ghettoized and so on, do you feel that special attention needs a kind of, I guess, affirmative action? And what form would that take, Crystal?
So to think about what Margaret said, I wasn't invited to the party. A lot of the people that I now publish or represent were not invited to the party. So we created our own party, and we created a party that was so live and happening and amazing that other people started to want to come to our party. And I think we also have to be very careful of that. I think subcultures have always dictated the mainstream, whether that's music or books, and often what happens is you create a party, people then want to take all of your ideas and all of your things, and they have the resource to do it where you don't. So rather than add to the party and give to your party, they then go and create their own. So I think affirmative action is interesting. I've spoken in the past about things like the Rooney Rule, which happens in America in NFL. So the idea that you don't have a quota where you have to employ people, but you have a quota where you have to interview people from, certain backgrounds which are being underrepresented. And then if you find people are the best person, you employ them. I think the problem sometimes with affirmative action or these schemes and these kind of diversity things, and I know firsthand from people that I mentor, you're then almost ostracized for just being the person on that diversity scheme. And so I think there's a lot to navigate there. Obviously, something needs to happen, but Margaret said we have to be optimistic, and I'm very optimistic about the independent spirit that's being born, and the fact that, as communities, we're taking things into our own hands, and there's a real movement building on the back of what Margaret done. And even yourself, Ella, there's so many people that have contributed to us, myself included, being able to do what we do now. And I think it's really about us taking things in the of tick boxing and how they're seen, and what is seeming to wait for invitations.
Okay, I did lose a little bit of that because of connection, so I hope everybody could hear the end of Crystal's response. Let's move on to the next question from the audience. Do you believe that the state of inclusion in the publishing industry varies from country to country? A lot of current narratives are very United States centric. And I was wondering if there are specific UK-based issues that could be addressed. And any of you, including Onomek, who would like to answer that question? Samantha, we can't see you, but hopefully we can now hear you.
Yeah,
Should I read the question
I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, let me read it again. And let's see who wants to answer the question on the panel. Do you believe that the state of inclusion in the publishing industry varies from country to country? And if there are any specific UK-based issues that could be addressed? Does anyone want to answer part of that? Then
I think of course there are many UK-based issues that could be addressed. I mean, we saw, for example, in Steve McQueen's television series of films, there were many issues in the history of the UK involved, for example, Black people that a lot of people did not know about, and that were given more profile in those films. So there will always be issues that could be addressed if people will allow them to be aired, if you like. And it could be publishers who are coming from those same communities doing it themselves, or other people recognizing that they need to engage with those. It's just the same way to have a month for Black history does not make sense. We're talking about history that affects everybody. It's all our histories. We cannot say only in October will we think about Black people and the history that they have, because their history is entirely connected with the rest of the world. In the same way that Andrea Levy, when she began, had difficulty finding an agent, and then had difficulty finding a publisher who thought she would find the readership, but ended up actually selling millions. So it's not simply that if you write, you're only going to write about things that will interest a Black audience, which will be small. You will write a good book, which may interest millions of people. In the same way, as a publisher, I did not only publish Black writers, I published good books. I published Scottish writers, white writers, male writers, Black female writers. So it's your world becomes bigger, not smaller, if you include issues that are not so-called the old normal. We want the new normal.
We want the new normal. Samantha, I'd like to move back to you. I don't feel like we've heard enough from you. And I just wondered if this was an issue that you could respond to as well, in terms of the alternative markets that you work so hard to find for your books and other things that that you sell to readers and to parents. Do you feel that there are different responses because you're looking outside of the normal, I guess, retail spaces? That's for you, Samantha.
I'm dialing in from a phone now, so hopefully you can hear me all right. I'm getting a terrible echo, so yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I think with me, I think like the Book Love Carnival is just like a very random concept, and it works. It's non-prescriptive. It's very much from the heart. And I think of it in those terms, and it's very much dictated from a place of activism and inclusion, and really reaching people and encouraging them to bring their whole selves to the book carnival, and really making sure that the products and the books and the items that we sell talk to everyone within the community, particularly Black and brown people. I have never done a business plan. I'm not really operating from that space. And somehow it just seems to work. People really enjoy it. People really love it. People feel included. And I think most importantly, people feel themselves. And, one of the things that, I always think about is, bookshops, some, don't always speak to all communities. They can feel like quite alien spaces. And like we are here today, outdoors in the middle of a field, surrounded by, I've got sushi to my left, I've got, jerk chicken to my right, I've got all the flags out, and straight away you kind of, you just break down those barriers. The literary world and books, tends to have a very kind of, to people who aren't familiar with books or may feel slightly alienated. And I think sometimes the publishing world actually enjoys that alienation, and I think they quite like to feel important, and that can alienate a lot of people, really. And that's really what the Book Love Carnival is trying to reject and push back against. And I just kind of do it in the best way that I can. I hope that answers your question.
It does. I mean, a lot of the responses are coming back to those really important things about not just independence, but also about, I guess, curating our own stories and so on. And it's very useful. I just want to go on to some more audience questions. although we haven't focused on it, I think I've been really pleased that the focus of our conversation has been about those larger structures and I guess more fundamental and macro issues within the industry. A lot of the audience is concerned with more micro issues. So, for example, quite a few of the questions are asking questions around fixing the industry. One that I'd like to turn to because I think it's very topical and it's one that we ourselves sort of discussed in our preparations. The question starts, hello, I've been keen to ask panelists about the opportunities and limits of the use of sensitivity readers and whether they are part of the solution at all. So, who'd like to tackle this? I'm so happy I'm not answering this question.
Can you repeat the question, Ella, please?
Of course, absolutely. I'd be keen to ask panelists about the opportunities and limits of the use of sensitivity readers and whether they are part of the solution at all.
Okay, I don't mind taking this.
Thank you, Crystal.
I think everything has opportunity and limitations, no matter what it is. But I think it's the intent with which things are done and the way that they're used. My worry sometimes with sensitivity readers, although they can be helpful, is that it offloads the burden from the publisher onto someone else. Often when you think about who these sensitivity readers are, it's people who, you know, seem like that they're ethnic minorities or they're minorities in some other way, and so publishers feel like, okay, well, if they say it's okay, it's all okay, and that offloads the burden. And I think so much the problem of what's wrong with the industry not changing is it's always offloading responsibility and burden to someone else. That said, of course, if you don't have the staff in-house, which in itself is a problem, so maybe we need to stop looking at symptoms and start thinking about causes for things. If you literally don't have staff in-house who have any understanding of what an author is writing about or what an author might perceive, that's a problem, and you need to find a way to address it. So I think there's not a right or wrong way to do it, but I think it's about why are you needing sensitivity readers where you don't have that in-house in the first place? Because when books are published, they go through so many different people: commissioning editors, copy editors, proofreaders, marketing people, publicity people. Sometimes they then go out into the wider world and prizes or press, or, you know, there's so many people looking at these books. And so if along all of that way there's only one person that can pick up on the fact that something's problematic, and that's a sensitivity reader that's paid not very much, where a huge burden is put on them, then this is very problematic. So I'm not saying that there's no space for them, but I think how they're used and why they're used is the things we really need to be asking and look at.
Thank
If
you,
I could
Crystal.
just
I was about to call on you because your body language, I thought you'd jump out of your seat. I'm a yes.
Yeah, no, I mean,
please.
once again, Crystal's kind of encapsulated my. I think so much of the kind of the challenges with sensitivity readers, which was a phenomenon I was not aware of until I started this research, actually, and I've kind of got mixed feelings about it in exactly the ways that Crystal suggests. But if we take a step back, what it shows is that publishers are scared and fear. Well, the first thing I want to say, building on Crystal's point, is that there's no right or wrong way to represent anyone, right? And people within, say, the Black or Asian community can argue about a particular depiction of a Black or Asian protagonist, right? We, in fact, often while we're having a coffee, having a drink over dinner, we'll engage with these heated debates with our friends and family about, the representation of a particular character. So there's no right or wrong way to do it. And a sensitivity reader is not really going to solve that issue. But if we take a step back, I think what it shows is that publishers are scared now. And I think this is a really interesting moment. I'd love to hear Margaret's thoughts and you as well, Ella, because you've been, by your own admission, been in the industry for a very long time. And I think there is a very interesting moment now in which where audiences can talk back to publishers in ways that perhaps they were never able to do in the past. Sam and I were talking about this yesterday, weren't we, Sam, about yeah, the fact that, you know, social media, as much as it's, oh god, such a fraught, troubled, problematic space, it nonetheless has kind of allowed us to talk back. In the past, we had, you know, all press was good press was the marketing adage, but that doesn't count now. You know, publishers are petrified of being cancelled, right?
Do
Again,
you
to use
think
that.
that publishers are scared though?
Yeah, I think
Do you think
it's a
they're really
fear
scared,
of kind of.
honestly?
I think they're scared in the sense that, you know, it kind of, what in our research we found that publishers consider themselves very liberal and open, right? And when that was challenged by people who were kind of calling out, you know, whatever forms of privilege they have, then this provoked a very defensive reaction. Everyone was on the in our research, all of the people were on the spoke very passionately about why diversity matters. But when you start kind of calling into question some of the assumptions that are held about minoritized groups, we got a very different reaction. And so, yeah, and as Crystal says, I think the kind of the ascendancy of sensitivity readers, albeit, you know, in very particular genres, and as Crystal says, it's not like these people are very well paid or anything like that, but it is a way of kind of dealing with that fear factor. I'm not sure about politics launched from a politics of shaming is necessarily something that I personally want to get on board with, but nonetheless, that is what is transforming publishers and their attitudes to rights and colours in both good and bad ways. I think it's very ambivalent. It's an overused academic word, ambivalent, which basically means when the same kind of outcome can have both positive and negative effects simultaneously.
Margaret, what do you think about
to
this?
me? Well, I think that what I notice is, why are these conversations not happening within the publishing companies? Why do you have to go to somebody outside or get outside responses to what you're doing? I mean, the publishing companies should be, you know, peopled with enough intelligent folk who can have these conversations before they become a problem to the outside world. I mean, it reminds me, years ago, I had a friend who's, you know, a white friend on a national newspaper, who phoned me up to check whether a headline was potentially racist, because they didn't have anybody to ask within the company. So that, I suppose, I was another sort of sensitivity reader. So what, you know, you need to have these conversations within the industry, and also there has to be. I mean, Toni Morrison wrote a lot of very interesting essays, particularly in her book Playing in the Dark. The subtitle was Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, where the assumption of a lot of writers is the reader is like them, i.e. normal, white, middle class, or whatever. So there are conversations that need to be had before you get to the sensitivity reader, before you get to the social media critics. What's happening when a book is taken on, when the book is being edited? Who are those editors? And I think, again, at Binyavanga Wainaina's How to Write About Africa, which, again, showed certain stereotypes that were being played out within the industry, because they thought that's how Africa should be portrayed, because they had no African involvement in the company. So there are lots of things that, to me, show up the fact that the publishing companies themselves need to have internal change before you get to any external criticism of what is being published. You need to see what is happening when a book is taken on, why a book is being taken on, who is editing that book, who's putting the jacket on that book, as well as who's going to review that book. So it becomes a societal thing. Why only certain books reviewed? Who are the reviewers? If you have one book by a Black writer reviewed this week, can you have another one? I remember, again, in 2019 doing panels for New Daughters of Africa, and one of the writers on the panel said, oh, well, she had been going to have a feature in a national newspaper, but they had to postpone it because they'd already had something the previous week by a Black Muslim woman or whatever it was. So again, one has to represent all.
I think we could stay on this topic for a while, but I would like to move on to another audience question. This one is, how important do you feel the role of public libraries is in promoting and providing access to diverse books? I guess, books by or about a range of characters. Are they actively considered by publishers as customers of books when selecting and selling? And how much should publishers actively support this? And that's the stocking of the libraries. Interested, especially given the role of public libraries in providing access to those not from the middle classes. So that's a question on the role of libraries, but also on the curating, I guess, of libraries as well. And I wonder, Samantha, I'd love a response from you on this. I don't know if it's something that you have spent much time focusing on, but just, from your instinct and your experience, do you want to give us the first response to that?
Yes. Sadly, my response is contentious. Libraries conceptually are fantastic spaces. They're democratic, they're free for all. However, when you walk into libraries, that is not always reflected regarding the stock that you find on the shelves. When we are out and about selling at various locations, I am always approached by librarians. They run over, they love our books, they want us to bring books to their libraries, they want to buy from us, but they always stop in their tracks and say, unfortunately, we can't get books from you because we have contracts that are as heavy and as thick and as long as whatever, that prevents us from reaching out to independent suppliers like you. And that might sound like quite a boring block and a boring barrier, but it's a very real barrier. The barrier to getting inclusive books into libraries, when you really start to drill down, it will make you sick and it will make you very sad. And these are the obstacles that I face every day when I am desperately speaking, not just to Black librarians, Asian, African, Caribbean librarians, white librarians who want to have the books that I have, but they're just not allowed to access them because their budgets won't allow them to buy from us. They are tied into contracts, and these are very real problems. And again, it's just another obstacle. There are hundreds of obstacles. And it's like, so when we talk about publishing and decolonizing publishing and decolonizing the landscape, there are hundreds and hundreds of walls to take down, brick by brick by brick. And then we ask ourselves, how are we in this situation? This situation will never change unless these old contracts are dismantled, not just in library service, but across the whole sector.
And really what you're talking about there emphasizes Onomic's point about policy and sort of, looking at things from a much wider level. This moves us on to our next question.
There's so much money in it. It's so much money. Someone is making a lot of money and they will not want to change the policy because they are protected by these contracts. So if we want to start having some uncomfortable conversations, we need to start having them. Sorry.
No. It's okay. It's okay. I'm just conscious we have a few minutes left. I'd like to fit in a couple more questions, but thank you for that. The next question says, radical change is rightly being recognized as a top-down process. Does the shift in focus from hiring diverse entry-level employees imply that this has no impact? Are there opportunities for people of color to progress within the industry? I guess we've touched on that quite a lot, but if we could just focus on the beginning of that question, radical change is rightly being recognized as a top-down process. Does the shift in focus come from hiring entry-level employees imply that this has no impact? Yes, Anomet, yeah?
Yeah, I know. That's a really good question. And sometimes it sounds like in my work that sometimes the emphasis on increasing number of people from minoritized groups in these industries is a waste. The mainstream part is a waste of time. And actually, that's not the case at all. And actually, I've been working with doing some research with Creative Access, and they've done a pretty kind of amazing they've had an amazing impact in actually kind of opening doors and opportunities for people from minoritized groups who had never, ever kind of even been able to set foot in any of these spaces. interestingly, and this is in light of what Crystal's kind of, I think, very interesting critique of affirmative action, but creative acts is able to do that by taking advantage of the one space where you can take advantage of positive discrimination, where in internships, basically. So if an industry, if you can, is shown to be kind of lacking diversity, internships is one way where you can create opportunities for people from those minoritized groups to go in. And so that does make me think, as much as I share some of the ambivalences as Crystal, I wonder if there is still something there to kind of prise open, actually. So yeah, of course, and those things do happen, and people of color have to, we have to make livings, and why shouldn't they have the same opportunities to work in these, kind of mainstream core publishing houses, which can be really inspiring places to work. So absolutely. Is it a bit of a cop-out just to say we need both? I know it feels like such an obvious answer, right? But we need to do that work, getting these people in, but also that shouldn't be, I guess my point is, we shouldn't assume that that's the answer by itself, just having more Black, brown, Asian people in these industries, because then actually what happens is you end up internalizing the same logics and processes as everyone else, and you don't necessarily enact the change that you want to enact. You're not given the space to flourish within those spaces. So so that's why we need a combination of both. And I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's I think it's true.
I don't think it is. In fact, it kind of inspires me to say that if the book festival had given us, say, 4 hours, maybe we could write a manifesto and solve everything. Certainly with this panel. I'd like to close out by just asking each of you to look to the future. Thinking about the work that organizations such as the Royal Literary Fund's Writers' Mosaic has done. We've mentioned the BAE Network and the Black Writers Guild. Thinking about sort of the wonderful independents, Jacaranda, Nights Off, and thinking about sort of the different magazines and all of the things that have happened in the past 12 to 18 months, the work that we've all been doing during COVID, I guess, to me seems to be really powered by younger people of Crystal's generation and younger who are creating their own spaces, even if they're working within the mainstream or normal industry, but creating spaces for discussion and support, which to me is the difference between now and 20 years ago, is that those networks of support are really powerful. That gives me hope. I think that the energy going on from just the young sort of activist publishers right now is very exciting to me. And I wondered if I could ask each of you to maybe mention an organization or an initiative that you feel is kind of heralding a future in a way that is going to benefit us all. And Samantha, I wonder if I could start with you, and then we'll move to Crystal, then Margaret, then end up with Onomet.
So to name an organisation, can I name Book Love, the multicultural travelling book club?
Absolutely.
No, in all seriousness, I just want to make a point here that, this conversation can sound pessimistic at times, but I want to make it very, very clear that I absolutely love doing what I do. I get a lot of enjoyment from it. And I love working with my community and giving families and children content that they can't find easily. There is nothing more beautiful than feeling like playing a part in their educational empowerment. And this is something that I have made a lifelong commitment to. So, as long as I'm on this planet, I will continue to do that. And I'm looking, hopefully, to build, like you said, younger folks coming up behind me who can carry on this legacy. Hopefully, that is my aspiration. It's so needed. So I am very optimistic. And I think what Crystal said beautifully is about the subculture, and it's about, forging ahead and creating our own path. And that's what I'm really excited about. You talk about parties. Let's create our own festivals, our own networks, and just build our own content ourselves without having to rely on this archaic industry that really doesn't want us there.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm going to ask the rest of you to be super quick because we have run over time. So, Crystal.
I'm also very optimistic because of the network of activism and protests, and not only that we're all doing it individually, but we're doing it collectively, and we are building on the work that people such as Margaret and Ella, having been an editor in the industry for so long, have done before us. And I think it's the fact that we're no longer siloed, but we're working collectively as independents and as activists, that it's a hugely optimistic time. In terms of an organisation, so I'm actually going to mention Influx Press, which funnily enough is run by two white men. And I think I deliberately want to mention them because I think when we're thinking about systematic change and pushing forward, again, we can't be siloed in our thinking. So it's not just to say, if you're a person of colour, you're the person making a change. It's about collectively finding like-minded people who care about humanity and stories and the change that they can make in the world. And if that happens to be run by two white men, that's no less relevant to this conversation than any of the work that we're doing. And I think if we change our mentality and thinking, we're going to change the industry much quicker.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Margaret?
Well, I'm not going to pick any one organisation. I really applaud the work that's been done by Crystal, by Samantha, by the younger generation in general. But I think we have to applaud the Edinburgh International Book Festival for having this sort of discussion take place, and also look to the history, something like the International Book Fair, Radical Black and Third World Books, which actually showed the relationship between books, culture, and politics, and is a lesson that we could all take, learn from, and continue forward in different ways. So let's all learn from each other, and may the younger generation build on the lessons of the past.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And Arnamic, super quick, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you, Margaret, for including me in the younger generation. Actually, I'm not sure if I'm really qualified. I just want to, as much as I've talked about the top-down policy, I just want to give a shout out to those networks that all exist within the major publishing houses of people from people who work within those organisations from minoritized backgrounds who are trying to shape the agendas of those publishing houses. I've seen I encountered some really amazing kind of networks within those spaces. And so as much as we want to support independent kind of alternative modes of producers, actually powerful things can still happen within the core. And yeah, that's driven from below. So yeah, shout out to those people as well.
Thank you all so much. I've been sort of inspired by this conversation. I'd like to sit in a bar with you all, and I think we could solve a lot more than just this problem, actually. I'm so grateful to you all. Arnamic, I want to say a special thank you to you for helping change our language. I think there are ways that you've been phrasing things that have really struck me about how the words that we use can be powerful, minoritized groups rather than ethnic minorities, but also thinking about that act of harm that discrimination can, or unchecked privilege can do, and in fact has and is doing. Samantha, Crystal, and Margaret, very lovely to see you too, and thank you so much for your contributions. My thanks to the wonderful team at the Edinburgh Book Festival. Please join the Society of Young Publishers. I'm speaking of young, powerful people in the conversation at 11:30, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Just on that positive note, we'll wrap it up there. If you enjoyed this event, check out more of the Edinburgh International Book Festival's Business of Book events happening throughout the month. The recording of this event will also be available on the Book Festival's YouTube channel if you want to revisit it later on.
A huge thanks to Ella Wakatama for chairing this brilliant discussion, and to our wonderful speakers, Margaret Busby, Crystal Mahey Morgan, and Samantha Williams, for sharing their stories and voicing the concerns that face publishing today. Of course, this event could not have been possible without Arnamic Shaha's findings and invaluable contributions to the discussion.
Thank you, Edinburgh International Book Festival, for organising this event and reaching out to SYP Scotland to collaborate. We look forward to working with you in the future. And thanks to you for being a wonderfully engaged audience. If you'd like to see more such Business of Books events at the festival in the future, please do let us know using the chat function and the short survey that will soon follow. We really do appreciate your feedback.
To continue chatting about this event and the changes that we ourselves can make, SYP Scotland is hosting a post-panel discussion in about 4 minutes. And we'd love to see you there. The Zoom link is in the chat. Thank you all again, and see you soon.